gives me really great pleasure to introduce really our first big college in-person named lecture, and that is the Gerald Westheimer Lecture. But let me tell you a little bit about how it became the Gerald Westheimer Lecture. What we are awarding our guest, who I'll introduce in just a second, is the Glenn A. Fry Medal in Physiological Optics, which we don't do very often. We have given it 16 times since 1987 to folks like Glenn Fry, Torsten Wiesel, David Hubel, Merton Flom, there's a familiar name, Velma Dobson, John Dowling, and in 2014 we gave a Fry Medal to Gerald Westheimer from the University of California, Berkeley. And when Jerry was here, he followed up afterwards and said, could I create a lectureship that would be linked to any time you were giving a Fry Medal? Fry was his mentor, and actually if you were at that lecture, we heard some stories about those days that weren't the most uplifting for our college, but was a bit of a tribute to mentorship, that in spite of some of those rough times, that Jerry Westheimer still wanted to attach his name in perpetuity to any time we gave a Glenn Fry Medal. So that's hence why it's the Westheimer Lecture for the Fry Medal Award. And our most recent one up to now was 2016, when we gave a Fry Medal to Dr. Susan Cotter from the Southern California College of Optometry. So it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce to you someone some of you know very well, and some of you may not know as well, and that is Dr. John Cruz. So he is our 2022 Westheimer Lecturer and Glenn A. Fry Medalist. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English and a Master's of Arts in English from Indiana University, worked as an English instructor for a few years, and then went to Western Michigan University, where he earned a master's degree in vision rehabilitation and a doctorate of public administration. And throughout his 45-year career, he's been, one might say, interested in, more accurate would be utterly passionate about, health, functional, and social disparities among people with and without vision impairment, how we strengthen our approaches to vision surveillance, who has the things that we take care of every day, and creating and measuring evidence-based programs. He retired from the position of Senior Research Scientist in the Vision Health Initiative at the National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Bottom line, he worked for the CDC. Hopefully you heard that. He retired in 2018. But from what I know, this has not slowed him down at all. So you may say, okay, wait a minute. Vision surveillance, I get it. What's the connection between Dr. Cruz and Ohio State? The better question is, who led Dr. Cruz to Ohio State? And that's our own Dr. Dean Van Nasdale. Since Dr. Cruz first visited us in 2015, he has been an extraordinary advocate for the College of Optometry and our program. And he and Dean's graduate students have worked together to produce a body of work, which I'm not going to preview because I know that's what you're going to talk about, in the area of public health, vision surveillance, and visual impairment. I am so honored that our first sort of reconvening in-person event is the Westheimer Lecture featuring Dr. John Cruz. Please join me in welcoming him.
I have an on button. Well, thank you for taking time away from your dinner hour to join me tonight. I really appreciate it. I have such high regard for Ohio State. I'm from Indiana, and I think there's just this wonderful Midwest sensibility that kind of characterizes Ohio and Indiana and Michigan and Illinois. So I'm just really delighted to be here tonight. So, but let's see, do we go to screen? How do we do this? Okay, all right. So the title of the talk tonight is the intersection of public health and vision, and I've been kind of fiddling with this idea for some some months now, and the lecture keeps changing. So because some of the data keep changing, so I just want to share some of that. So Winston Churchill said, "Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen." So I want to honor all of you for the courage that you have to listen to my talk tonight. This is a picture of my dad on the right-hand side, and I'm not quite sure how old he is there. And that's his sister. His sister's name was Ole. It was spelled O-L-A. And they grew up in Crawford County, Indiana. So it's kind of like southern Ohio. It's very beautiful and extremely poor. And he was born 1908. And this is a picture of my mother, my paternal grandmother, and my maternal grandmother. This is as close as they ever got to each other. My paternal grandmother was illiterate, and ended up with 4 husbands. So she had, and she and her husband were largely subsistence farmers. So when my dad was 13, his father lost his vision, and so as a 13-year-old, he was the only male in the family, and in 1920, there was no social safety net, there was no social security. So my dad quit the 8th grade. Truth be told, he probably only had a 3rd grade education because he only went to school a couple of months a year. And he went to work building roads from the stone quarries of southern Indiana. So it's this guy right here who is my dad. I look at some of these guys, I think my dad's kind of a nice looking guy, but this guy looks pretty tough to me. I don't know that I would want to work with him. And I think my dad's probably about 18 there. And so the point is that given the environment in 1920, my grandfather's loss of vision affected my parents, my father's trajectory in his life. So he had an 8th grade education, came into the world. There's not much you can do with it. In fact, he hauled trash. He was a janitor. I don't know how I got a PhD, but anyway, it happened. So vision loss affects the trajectory for the person in the family, and it represents both an individual and a collective experience, and that's the context that I want to present this tonight. So I have an outline. So what I want to talk about is public health model, and then I want to talk a little bit about vision surveillance because that's really fun, and I truly believe it's fun. And then I want to talk about vision and disparities. And I want to give you a taste of some of those regarding health, chronic conditions, social economic status, geographic distribution. It's not just the number of people with vision impairments, but how they are different and where they are that I want to talk about. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of the talk tonight talking about a project that Dina and I have been working on with a group called VisionServer Alliance. VisionServer Alliance is a trade organization, an association of private agencies for the blind in this country. It's a very good time for them. They have fabulous leadership, and they're doing some wonderful things. And so Dina and I had an opportunity to help them in a way that they hadn't thought about. And then I want to kind of have a thread in this talk talking about the social determinants of health and kind of use that as a framework. And I think this recent work that we've done really underlies the importance of that and suggests, I think, kind of the very layered, nuanced, complex experience that vision loss presents for older people. I'm just going to focus on older people tonight. So all of us have our careers and our disciplines, and we all tend to define problems from our discipline, and we solve those problems from our discipline. And so public health has a distinct point of view to define a problem, and it has a distinct point of view in solving those problems. So So public health is concerned about the population. So it's not just the clients that you see coming in the door. It would be like the city of Columbus, it would be the state of Ohio, any unit, but I want to know about all of the people in that area. So it can be defined any way you want to, but public health is interested in the entire population, not just a select piece of that. So the important thing within public health is to figure out, well, for any issues, what's the case? So what's the case definition? How do we define something of interest? And so, we all became experts in public health during the COVID thing, and a big piece of it is, do you have COVID or is it something else? So you have a case definition that gives you a sense of what you're included in that. And then the thing that I think that continues to amaze me about public health, the public health approach, is that its ability to define a problem and to deconstruct a problem. So there's lots of problems in society that we view as so complex that they're intransigent. They cannot be solved, so we just turn our back on that. And public health is really good about kind of figuring out what that problem is, and then figure out points of intervention. Because if you can't deconstruct the problem, you can't figure out where the intervention is. And then public health loves to count, so I've got lots of numbers for you because they make people in public health happy. So this is kind of a rough model. I call it the old model of public health, actually. It's kind of the one that I was trained under. But the whole idea is you got a problem here, and then you have some sense of a rational response. So it's a rational decision model. And what you want to know at the beginning of that, the foundation, is what is the magnitude of the problem? How big is it? What defines that problem? Is it getting bigger? Is it getting smaller? Is it staying the same? So we focus on this surveillance as this foundational piece. Then once you understand the magnitude of the problem, then you start asking questions. You can just think, I got to think about this with COVID. First we're just trying to figure out what it is and how many people it affected, but then we realized that there were disparities in terms of who got COVID, who got treatment for COVID. People had different trajectories who had the disease, getting better, getting worse. So you have to understand that, and once you understand that, then you can kind of figure out what might be a potential intervention to deal with that complex problem. And then if you can test something and it works with some degree of rigor, then you can implement that, you can scale it up and implement that either in the community, nationally, whatever. So this is kind of the way you think about it. So if you don't get this right, then all the rest of this is wrong. If you underestimate the problem, then people suffer. If you overestimate the problem, then you direct resources to something that that should be that should potentially be addressed elsewhere. So I think I've said all this. Surveillance foundation public health. It's population based. It can be any unit. It can be the nation, the world. It can be the community. People think we make this up, and so surveillance is driven by rigor in science. We have to get that right, and so we can't underestimate it or overestimate the magnitude of the problem. So this is my favorite part. Tell me, so now there's a fair amount of intellectual muscle in this room. So I want you to tell me how many older visually impaired, no, you can just tell me anything. I mean, tell me how many people there are with vision impairment in the United States. Just give me a number, or a percent. I'll pick a percent, and I can figure it the other way.
Low vision colleagues, we're all looking at you.
Look at your shoes, not the answers on your shoes. Give me a number. Any number.
Everybody.
What's that?
Everybody.
Yeah, all right, that's a little high. 280 people. Just a wild, I'll take a wild guess. I'm trying to make a point. Yes, sir.
Roughly, vision impairment percentage would maybe be like 2.5% or less.
2.5%. Okay, that's a good number. Let me see if I can work on that. Okay, how about another number percent?
Are you including refractive error? Or not?
If you want to.
If I want to.
Yes.
Do we include presbyopia?
If you want to.
Okay, then I'm going to back all the way down to 60%. 60%.
Well, so you can imagine, CDC, I got calls weekly. How many people in the United States have vision impairment? Because you look, every grant anybody has ever written begins. The Center for Disease Control indicates there's blank number of people who have blind, right? So you go to CDC to get that number. People call me up every week, how many people have vision impairment?
Right.
My response is, you tell me how many you want there to be, and I will give you the study. All right, so this gives you a sense of what this looks like. I've contributed to some of this in my own way, and Dean has contributed most recently to this. So there's multiple studies. I've only cited about 8 or 10 here that give kind of wildly different populations. 3.3 million people over the age of 40, 5.7 million, which was a paper I published in 2006, 14 million, that's more, 21 million, and that's it includes the refractive error. 1.2 million blind, 3.22 million vision impairment, 2040 to 2200, and then, 1.2 million blind, 3.2 million with vision impairment, and 8.2 million with refractive error. It's an article by Rohi Varma that gets cited a lot. And then Dean and I have recently published, we haven't published, I guess it hasn't been peer reviewed, but we published a study that shows about 7.3 million people over the age of 65, so about 3.8 million. Starts to match up, but it's wrong population. So there's a desire to have large numbers, especially if we're trying to make a kind of an advocacy case, but why? Now the thing of the people, who've done this work, these people are pretty smart, so they're not making it up. Why do you think we get such varied numbers? I already told you the answer. Yes?
Criteria.
Yeah, it's case definition. Yeah, so all these studies have a different case definition of vision impairment. So there's huge consequences to this. I mean, especially if you're trying to make policy. Somebody said, you try to affect somebody who's policy maker, and you say, oh, well, he says how many visually impaired people are there, and 10 people come in the door, and they've read 10 different papers, and they have 10 different estimates. So we don't have a standard case definition that is used in surveys, because if you're going to have a survey, you have to ask somebody. You can't, very few surveys, only one national survey that has clinical examination. So these are all self-report. So this gives you a sense of just how, I won't say crazy it is, but it's just kind of where the science is, and it keeps evolving. But since you've all been in clinical settings, how reliable are your patients when you ask them about the disease that they have? Not the respondent's not a reliable respondent. That's what we call it, right? Well, there are surveys. There's at least 2 surveys that ask people, has a physician, so the STEM, just so you know, for most of these surveys, the STEM for the question is, has a physician or the healthcare provider told you you have diabetes, have hypertension, but it's always the STEM is the same. Has a physician or the healthcare provider told you? So in some surveys, it asks, has a physician or the healthcare provider told you you have macular degeneration? And then ask if you had cataract removed, glaucoma, and so these data are collected nationally. But how useful do you think that is? given your experience? Not very useful. Okay. So then you can ask another question. So if you have clinical data, it's very different from self-report. But for clinical data, you've only got people coming to the door. You don't have population-based data. So there are other questions that are asked about difficulty seeing. Just so you ask people how much difficulty, if any, you have seeing. That is, I'm going to share some questions with you. Then there's activity questions that ask how, if you have difficulty reading print. There's an environmental question in one survey that asks, can you drive at night in unfamiliar neighborhoods? So what are you measuring? It's supposed to be a division question. Is it measuring driving? Is it measuring illumination? So now there's two questions. One question that has moved not toward a gold standard question, but a standard question that's asked in survey. And that question is, are you blind or do you have serious difficulty seeing? That question was developed by the American Community Survey as part of the census. There's 6 disability questions that are asked in that survey. I don't know anybody who does this kind of research that's happy with the question, but it's used both by the census and behavioral risk factor surveillance system and all HHS surveys and administrative data. So we've got now a standard vision question that is integrated into all these systems, but it's not a real good question. All right? So, by and large, there's no surveillance system in the United States. No one owns vision. So what researchers like me do is, I write a paper. I'll say that for the purpose of this paper, the case definition of vision impairment is a positive response to blank, blank, blank. And then I go on my merry way to write the rest of the paper. And then now the limitations, I'll say, this may be a policy question, but it's the one I got in the survey. I'm not going to stand up and say we need to have standard questions. I'm just going to say this is a limitation. So no one has ever just said we need to harmonize these data until more recently. So one step toward that is a CDC funded project called the Vision Eye Health Surveillance System that collects a variety of surveillance data with multiple vision questions and tries to make that available to the community, but really has not resolved any of these differences. So we really don't know, for example, when we started asking these questions, what part of the population we're asking. But I want to give you some examples of that and then move right on. Okay, so the National Health Interview Survey is the largest survey conducted in this country. It's both telephone and paper, and people make visits. And so the standard question's been asked since, I think, 1955 is, do you have any difficulty seeing even when wearing glasses? And if the respondent says yes, then they're asked, are you blind? Okay, so kind of a wide open question. Do you have any difficulty seeing even when wearing glasses? So the response category, the response rates are really high. All right, that's what we got. And then the BRFSS, Behavioral Risk Factor. So you all know about the BRFSS? Okay, the BRFSS is called Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. It's a survey conducted by the Centers for Disease Control, samples 140,000 people a year. Data collected from January to December. Data from 2021 will be available probably in May 2022, so it's recent data, large samples, the world's largest telephone survey. And so for a number of years, we had a vision module, and I think these questions are super. There are two commanding questions that deal with function. How much difficulty, if any, do you have recognizing a friend across the street? Would you say no difficulty, a little difficulty, moderate difficulty, extreme difficulty, unable to do because of eyesight? So it's a near a distance question, and then a near question: how much difficulty, if any, do you have reading newspaper, print and newspaper, magazines, recipes, menus, or notice on telephone? Would you say no difficulty? No difficulty, low difficulty, moderate difficulty, extreme difficulty, unable to do. Great questions, I think. We terminated that survey, I think, in about 2010. We offered it to a number of states. Ohio has implemented this survey every year that was offered. I think they've done it even when we weren't paying for it. Now this is kind of interesting in terms of, interesting experience in terms of the interest in vision impairment. What we told states was, if you implement this survey, we'll pay the freight. All you gotta do is say yes, and we'll pay all the costs associated with implementing that survey. It'll be publicly available. We'll even do some of the analysis. And only 22 states took us up on that over the course of about 8 years. And then we had a funding cut, and we decided to turn it, so the question's not asked now. Then in the, we also, in that survey, and in the health interviews, the National Health Interview Survey, there were questions about if you've had various eye diseases and had cataracts or cataracts removed. And that survey is implemented about every 8 years. Then the American Community Survey that I mentioned at the BRFSS now asks the same question: are you blind, or do you have serious difficulty seeing? And response is yes or no. So it's a good question to capture severity, but all the action just isn't among people who have severe vision impairment. So we don't know anything about people who have a little difficulty or moderate difficulty seeing. We only know about people who have severe difficulty. That information is hugely insightful, though. But I've concluded after working on this for more than a decade, is that maybe we've spent too much time on trying to get the right number. What we need to start looking at is how are people with vision impairment different from people without vision impairment. The numbers kind of, they're accurate enough that we can work with that. There's convergence in those numbers, and we can justify each of those questions, so we can figure out who it is. But there are greater questions, I think, that may really require attention, and I think has to do with disparities, social, economic, and health disparities. I want to talk about that. Geographic distribution. I want to talk about that. And communicating the knowledge that we know about people with vision impairment to people who can use that, whether they're policymakers or providers in the community, so we influence policy and practice. So here's our model. We want to understand first what's the magnitude of the problem. We understand there's limitations in the case definition. But then how, the question is, is everybody who has a vision impairment, are they alike? Are they like people without vision impairment? And if they're not like people with vision impairment, how do they differ? And what measures do they differ? And it's from that we begin to influence policymaking. So we understand, how people are different. So we can look at age group, we look at gender, race, ethnicity, comorbidity, health behaviors, health outcomes. I made a living doing this. This is kind of where all my research is. And then we can look at gaps of both access and utilization. So that begins to identify where the action is. That's kind of where you come in. So where's the magnitude of the problem, and then what can we do about it? What are the underlying problems? So I'm going to give you some examples. It's probably looks familiar. This is from the 2 questions from the behavioral risk factor visual module, the one that we dropped. But this just gives you a sense of what the distribution is. If you ask about people having no difficulty seeing, a little difficulty seeing, which I think is super important, then you ask about moderate, extreme, and unable. What we know is that as people get older, they're more likely to report vision impairment. We already know that. Okay, but what's important is that this group, I think, there's a lot of action here. There's something going on. We don't know. We don't know the pathway. We don't know the cause. We just know that a substantial number of people report a little difficulty seeing. The number that report moderate and severe difficulty keeps increasing with age. We know that. We also know that women are more likely to have vision problems than men. That's pretty well established. By any measure, whatever question you ask, we have the same pattern. And then we also know that people who are Black, African American, Hispanic are more likely to have vision impairment. Again, another kind of well-established pattern. So I want to look at some of the ways other ways that people with vision impairment are different. So this is a study. I I published, I think, 2016. And I was using health interview survey data, so you have another data set. And the question is, do you have any trouble seeing even with direct glass or contact lenses? And then the follow-up question is, are you blind? Asking that question of older people, get 14.6%. That's the response rate. So pretty high. And then what I did was I wanted to know, what I think is, as a clinician, this probably looks familiar, but you've never seen it. You've seen it in clinical records, but you probably haven't seen it in a population-based study. So I looked at about 14 conditions in the paper here. 6: hypertension, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, depression, and hearing impairment. So in all cases, people who have vision impairment are more likely to have these common age-related chronic conditions, more likely to have hypertension, more likely to have heart disease. You know, we did do odds ratio. I didn't do odds ratios on these, but you know, maybe twice as likely to have stroke. That makes sense, doesn't it? You know, stroke and much more likely to have diabetes. That makes sense. And then they're much more likely to have, from 12% to 20%, much more likely to have depression. So that could be, we don't know the pathway, but could be that people lose vision impairment and then they get depressed. What we do know is that behavioral health for people with disabilities and older people generally is miserable in this country. So, you know, for many of you, if you have a client, they have severe vision problem, you do the best you can, you think they're depressed, you probably don't have anybody you can refer to. So here's a gap, probably unaddressed. And then the question in this survey is asked if you have any difficulty hearing. So 51% of people with vision impairment, mostly men, report hearing impairment, and 35% report vision impairment. People without vision impairment report hearing impairment. So I think about the implications of each of these things. So you think about the clinical encounter for many people with vision impairment, and you're explaining exactly what you need to be doing, next steps. And the guy, it's going to be a guy, you finish the encounter, and the guy walks out with his wife and says, "What'd she say?" So communicating that information in an environment where somebody has hearing impairment is another barrier. So do these people just have greater chronic conditions? Is that the end of it? Yeah.
Can I ask a couple questions about that last
Sure.
one? So is that controlled for age?
Yes.
Okay.
Sure is. Thank you for asking.
Yep.
Most people don't know what you're talking about, but that's... So now then I want to ask, I want an outcome measure. So are these people, do they just have higher rates of these chronic conditions? So there's a measure in the survey. I can ask them they rate their health. Excellent, very good, fair, excellent, very good, good, fair, poor. So I wanted to identify the percent of people who reported fair or poor health who had these chronic conditions. So now what I'm showing is among people without vision impairment who have hypertension, a quarter of them report fair, poor health. 44% of people with vision impairment who have hypertension report fair or poor health. So health is an outcome measure for this thing. So then let's look at these others. Heart disease, 50%, stroke, 55%, diabetes, 55%, depression, so we said depression is twice as likely, and of the people who have depression, they're reporting their health is fair or poor, and then among the people with hearing impairment, the same pattern. So this pattern is pretty well established. So it's not all subtle. Look how this story starts to evolve. People with vision impairment, I don't have vision impairment, more likely to be women, more likely to be racial ethnic minorities, more likely to be older, more likely to have chronic conditions, and are more likely to report fair or poor health. So this constellation begins to widen very rapidly. So there are other disparities. I was very proud of this paper. I published a paper on the oral health status of people with vision impairment, I think about 5 years ago. It had to go through 10 levels, I won't tell you all the bloody details, it had to go through 10 levels of clearance at CDC, which is a miserable experience. I always watch to see how my papers are cited. Some of them have been around for a while. This paper's been cited twice. Absolutely no interest in the oral health status of people with vision impairment. But what I found, as you can imagine in this, is, and I won't bore you with the details of that study, but the oral health status of people with vision impairment is really substantial. I mean, the odds ratio is like 2 or 3 times more likely to have oral health problems. I think the take-home message for those of you interested in federally qualified health centers, they have wonderful oral health, they have a wonderful presence there, and they do a great job with chronic disease, trying to embed vision into federally qualified health centers. It seems to me the opportunities are right. I mean, there should be a path between the eye lane and internal medicine and dentistry. But other papers have looked at health-related quality of life, disability indicators, access and utilization of health care. It's kind of all these disparities that have looked at in the past. But here's kind of the take-home message. It's pretty consistent. Older, more likely to be women, more likely to be racial ethnic minorities, more likely to have age-related conditions, more likely to report fair or poor health. So, the other question is, are people with vision impairment equally distributed across the country? Is it as likely, if you live in Columbus, is it as likely for you to have vision impairment as it is to, I don't know, what's a little town on the Ohio River, Madison, Indiana? How's that close enough? Are you as likely to have vision problems, or is it just kind of spread out? Is it evenly spread out, or is it not? Well, it's not evenly spread out. So this just gives you a national picture. I'm going to drill down to the state here shortly, but this looks at counties. And so, you can look at the cut points in this. This is using that same question, are you blind, do you have serious difficulty seeing? That's the question. Prevalence rate is as low. This is for everybody 18 and over, so expect it to be not 65 and over. But look at the geographic patterns. All of West Virginia is pretty bad shape here. Had high prevalence vision impairment. Eastern Kentucky, beautiful part of the world, but not wealthy, not access to care. Lots of other things going on besides vision impairment. Then you kind of look across southern Georgia, where I live now, so southern Georgia. Then you look along the Rio Grande. So each of these, so you can figure this out. So here's Ohio, next, part of the Appalachian part of Ohio. So in this region, a lot of poor white people. In this region, a lot of poor black people. And this region, a lot of poor Hispanic people. It's played out very different ways. But and then, everybody out here, they're super. But there's a lot of stuff driving this, but this distribution identifies a lot of underlying factors. So I think, I've been as you're I taught college English for 6 years and decided there are other ways to start to that, so I changed careers and went into vision rehab and went through that program in 1976, so I've been kept in this field for a while. And there's been substantial changes, but 2016 marked, I think, kind of a big event, and I want to share it very close with you. And then, so in 2016, we published this study. I'm going to pass this around. This was, you've heard the Institute of Medicine, IOM, Institute of Medicine. Well, in 2015, 2006, we published this study in 2016, started in 2014. It's a $1.5 million study. Well, the way IOF does it is that you give them a bunch, you do a scope of work, how much you want, the questions you want to ask. You give them the money, and then they shut the door. They do what they want to do, but they do great work. And so what I wanted to do was to have a national consensus report on vision and public health. And so we published this in 2016, but in the middle of that, IOM decided to change its name from IOM, which everybody knows, to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So why, I don't know, but I want you to look at this. So really what we're trying to do here is, I'll start here, is to begin to frame the issue around public health. So you'll see some of the early chapters deal with surveillance issues. Second chapter deals with disparities. Chapter deals with community-based services. Chapter deals with vision rehabilitation. Anyway, it began to redefine things. It really pushed us onto a kind of national stage in a way that we didn't have before. And the thing with eye care is we're always got the orphan issue, in the world of things, and this kind of gave us the status to argue in a more competitive environment. And so, and I won't go through the details that you can just thumb through that and you get a sense of the priorities. I just urge you at some point when you have the leisure. I gave Carla a copy of it, so she has a lending library. So there's a copy floating around here. I can send another if you'd like. You can get a sense of what the priorities are in that, and I won't go through those. But there's a lot of things about that study that has just influenced how I think. And one is kind of how I thought about what this public health model looked like. And the fact of the matter is that the way to think about public health is not as a linear model. It's not a linear model at all. It's an iterative model. And it's informed by science, it's informed by interventions, it's informed by what we learn, and then taking that learning and then going back into that. What you'll see in the middle of this is the important role of research, and that has to do with surveillance, understanding the disparities, and so forth. Okay, so, and interestingly enough, so Dee and I have been working on this project for the last 8 months or so, and I've really changed my thinking in some ways that I just hadn't thought about because we're looking at this data in a different way. And so one has to do with social determinants of health. So the idea of social determinants of health has been around a long time and pretty much neglected. This guy named Michael Marmot in England who did what's called the Whitehall studies. And essentially what they did is they tracked these civil servants in the UK, and just what they found was the higher your status in the civil service, the better your health, greater the longevity, and the lower your status. And so that kind of became the foundation for that. And then they expanded dramatically to look at racial ethnic issues, social justice, health equity. So it's kind of regained a lot of attention. I've regained my appreciation for that. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of that work. So this is public health research in action. So this is what you can do with this. So it's not just talking to each other, but you're talking to other people and trying to influence them. So in 2021, last year, Dean and I began to talk to some folks with this VisionServer Alliance. It's this organization of private agencies for the blind, and they had new leadership, and they're really interesting agencies. I'm sure you know some of them. They're really uneven in this country, but there's some really remarkable leadership. And so what they've come together in this major national strategic planning effort, and to raise visibility and of vision rehabilitation, and to kind of move this ball, if you will, in policy. So they're developing some new federal legislation they want to introduce. They're developing leadership capacity among young professionals, trying to increase the visibility and measure the effectiveness of rehabilitation. But these are not people who do vision research. They're not scientists. They're not epidemiologists. They don't know about vision surveillance systems. So what I suggested to them was, so all they know, I'm not being critical, all they know is who comes in the door, and that's their population. So if they're in Columbus, I don't know if this is a private blindness agency in Columbus. In Cleveland, there's a big private agency in Cleveland. Okay, so so they say got 10 people come to the door, and they say, well, how many? Is that all of them, or is there a bunch of them out there that we're not serving, and who are they? They don't know that. They have zero information. So I approached this leadership, and I said, we can tell you about the prevalence of vision impairment in every state. We can stratify that by age, race, ethnicity. We can tell you the prevalence of vision impairment by county. And it's like, we were magicians. It was like, really? You can do that? And the table started levitating. And so what we proposed then was a project called the Big Data Project. And so Dean, Lisa Jordan, Matt Robish were all involved with that. It's in collaboration with VisionServer Initiative. So what we're doing, we are to talk. I'm retired. I'm 75 years old. I'm too old to be doing this. This is a 38-page report on the state of Pennsylvania, and I'm going to share some of the findings from that report, and then I'm going to share kind of what I have learned along the way. All right. So we've done 8 states. So just to remind you, we're using BRFSS data and ACS data, right? Community survey data. Case definition is, are you blind or do you have serious difficulty seeing even when wearing glasses? All right, and it's a positive response to that. As I mentioned, BRFSS samples 440,000 people. We can generate state level data, sample size large enough to do regional data. It uses a complex sampling frame for the people who do serious science. You have to do post-survey weighting in order to using census data. So here's what we did in the report. We provided state-level estimates of prevalence of vision impairment among people aged 65 and over by, for the whole population, by race, ethnicity, sex, and age. And then we provide county-level estimates of prevalence of vision impairment. And then in addition to that, because vision impairment is this complex human experience, we wanted to characterize the health status of people with vision impairment, chronic conditions that they experience. We're comparing chronic conditions in the state, so it's not national data, it's within the state. Compare people with and without vision impairment by chronic conditions. We want to examine health-related quality of life, talk about that, disability measures, income and poverty, which is my major epiphany in doing this, and educational level. So I'm going to give you some insight into that. So now we have this 38-page report, which I will start circulating. And let's see. So just to give you a sense, 38 pages. We started this. I said, well, we can do 6 to 8 pages. Let's knock this thing out. A couple of tabular tables and some narrative, and it'll be 12-point print, and it just kept growing. But so we have a map in every so there's an executive, you can look at when it comes around. There's an executive summary, just kind of tells the whole story, and then there's kind of this profile that kind of describes the nation, what's going on at the national level. Then we drill then into the state level data, and we have some state maps, shows county level data, and then try to begin telling a story here. So there are 8 states that we've done, and then the U.S. national data. Now, here's kind of my thing in this. Our role as scientists is to examine the data and do it accurately and select the variables that tell the story. But you really have to understand what the story is. You're not going to select data at random. You want those data to be telling the story, and it should emerge. So it kind of requires me. So here it is. We're going to have some audience participation here. So for 8 states now, you remember the states that I had? I don't forget. Let's go back up just so I'm going to help you out a little bit here. All right, here's the states: Pennsylvania, Illinois, Missouri, New York, California, Louisiana, Florida, and Oklahoma. Those are the states we're examining. We get U.S. data. All right, so the U.S. tells us all right. So the average prevalence of vision impairment for people over the age of 65 using the case definition that we've used is 7.3%. The lowest, interestingly, is Illinois at 5.8%. What do you think the highest is? If the lowest, so here's just the range.
I'm going Oklahoma.
Louisiana.
Oh, Louisiana, I heard Louisiana.
Oklahoma.
The duck comes down, the $100, you know, as say the magic word, $100. All right, if Louisiana is the highest, what's the following? What percent of people over the age of 65 in Louisiana have a positive response to the question, are you blind or you have serious difficulty seeing? Lowest is, here's the help, lowest is 5.8%. The average is 7.3%.
8.5.
The highest is
53.
8.5.
Everybody.
12.4%. Isn't that astonishing?
Yeah.
Sorry, no money's dead. Look at the range. So here's what we're talking about. Look at the data at a state level.
Just if you
Now, why Illinois is 5.8%? I can tell you why Louisiana is. We're going to see why Louisiana is. But why disparity? And just the prevalence of vision impairment. But this is the prevalence for all the eight states, and this is in alphabetical order. So that's just that's the rate. So you got Illinois 5.8%, Louisiana 12.4%, Oklahoma. Now look, I'm trying to make sense of all of these patterns, and they don't make sense. Pennsylvania is a wealthy state. Illinois is a wealthy state. California is a wealthy state. It has high. Louisiana's a poor state, Oklahoma's a poor state, so, you know, so that kind of makes sense. But then we're going to look at some other issues now. So this is the map I showed you earlier. All right. So I'm not going to show you the map first, but this is Missouri. I taught in Missouri for 3 years, lived in Springfield, Missouri, beautiful part of the country. You know, there's a lot of poverty in that. But anyway, at any rate, so the average prevalence of blindness and low vision in the state of Missouri is 7.6%, a little higher than the average. The county with the lowest prevalence of vision impairment is 2.6% for people 65 years of age and over. Isn't that amazing? 2.6%. So what do you think the county, you don't have to tell me the county, just tell me the percent. What do you think the highest prevalence is for a county for vision impairment in Missouri?
20.
Yeah, that's close. 21%. Now I'm going to show you the map. So Osage County is up in the middle of the state near Jefferson City, where the capital is. A lot of young people, university there. What was the name of that county? I've been there. Penobscot County is right down here in the Boot Heel. Here in this part of Missouri, here we get here, there's nothing there. It's called the Irish Wilderness. There's a road with no gas stations, but so it's really poor. So just kind of what you'd expect. Now I'm going to run through I'm going to run through a whole bunch of data because the time's running out. But here's again what we'd expect: higher prevalence of vision impairment among blacks, Native Americans. We had a high enough sample size. Native Americans, American Indians are hugely neglected. High prevalence, other chronic conditions. The surveys don't have enough sample size in order to fully understand the circumstances of Native Americans at a population level. But we will be able to do this using national data. All right, now one other question, then we'll just jump into this. All right, so in the United States, the prevalence of vision impairment among people 65 and older is among African Americans is the average is 10.5%. New York is 7.1%. What do you think the highest is? Just give me a percent. You can guess the state.
17.
If you live in Louisiana, and you're an African American over the age of 65, 1 person in 5 has severe vision loss. All right, so now what I want to do is kind of show you kind of this epiphany that I had regarding social determinants of health. I thought it was useful, but now I think it's really a powerful model. And so one of the contributors to that that you'd expect is this lower educational level among people with vision, who have vision impairment. They weren't born with vision impairment. You know, these aren't people, these aren't children in school. They grew older and developed vision impairment. But compared to their colleagues, people were less likely to graduate from high school, but more likely to develop vision impairment. Now, this is the thing that blew me away. In the United States, 16.9% of people older people without vision impairment have incomes of less than $20,000. Now, I've gone on vacation. I've had American Express bills paying over $20,000. Okay. How are you going to live on $20,000 a year? I don't know. But what do you think happens for people with vision impairment? 37% cases in coverage. Now, this just shows the income distribution. Same kind of table showing people with and without vision impairment and the percent. So Louisiana has the highest, but New York's a wealthy state. Half the people in the state of New York, and look at California. I mean, I'm sure there's mortgage payments that are bigger than $20,000 in New York. I mean, high rates of poverty. And then now you can look at this in a number of ways. And this, I've just got to think about it. And you can help me do this because I just started looking at this. You can look at the gap, and you think, well, wouldn't the gap be the same for each state if the circumstances are the same? Would that differential be the same for each state? You know, but no. The prevalence of low income is, you know, pretty narrow range here, but here it's astronomical. So we need to pay attention to income. Well, the fact of the matter is that if you have lower income and poverty people who are more likely to develop chronic conditions. So this is the pattern we saw: more likely to have stroke, more likely to have heart disease, more likely to have diabetes. Now so here's some of the variability of the data that I think just suggests the power of this granular analysis. The prevalence of stroke among people with vision impairment, look how consistent this is, 7777796. But look at the prevalence of stroke among people with vision impairment. Varies considerably from the state level. The state, it's that geographic distribution that is driving this. Then if we look at, diabetes,